was pregnant when we went down to Omaha. So that Christmas, we drove back to Minneapolis for Christmas. And on the way back home, my water broke before we got to Omaha. So I called my doctor, and she said, get on the airplane and come up here. So he put me on the airplane, and I went back to Minneapolis and stayed with his mother. And that was at Christmas time. The little devil never came until February the 11th. And I woke up Grandma about 4:30 in the morning, and we went to the hospital. And he was delivered about 8 o'clock. And my husband was out on the road, and I couldn't get him. And so he had to wait a whole, I don't remember if he called in finally or not. Anyway, he never saw the baby until the end of the week. And all the nurses said, oh, he was the cutest little thing. Of course, they had to say that. But anyway, it was a good time. And then I stayed with Grandma, I think, a week, and then we went back to Omaha. And in Omaha, and applied at the state health department for a job. And I got a job in, Hill Burton built hospitals and nursing homes then. And so we had to go out and inspect them to be sure that they had spent the money as they were supposed to. So I did that. I traveled all over the state of Nebraska, as my husband did. Incidentally, one day my husband was going to take a shortcut across the sand dunes of Nebraska, way out west. And he got stuck in the sand, and some guy flew over in his airplane and saw him and called the farmer, and the farmer came out with his tractor and pulled him out and took him to the next road. The people in Nebraska were wonderful. We had wonderful contractors that worked for him. Anyway, that was something that happened down there. Well, I got a little bored with that. No, I think I got pregnant. It seemed that was easy to do. And I went to, I think 8 months pregnant, and I got a phone call, and the man that had replaced me at the hospital, they found out he was an alcoholic. And so they wanted to know, would I come up and run the hospital while they found a replacement? So we discussed it, and I decided to go up. And I told them I was 8 months pregnant, and that was okay. And they would fly my husband up for the weekend, so we wouldn't be separated. Well, after a couple of weeks, the people who rented our house moved on, so we had this big empty house. So Herb said, I'll quit my job, and you ask for your job back, and I'll come back to Minnesota. So we did that, and his boss was nice enough to give him a job, the same job, up in Minnesota. And so the movers moved us. Standard Oil moved us up there. And they even packed the garbage that I had under the sink. I couldn't believe it. But anyway, that's how we got back up to Minnesota. And I had my baby, and I had an excellent secretary. And so I just moved my office up to my hospital room and continued with my regular work, and she took care of the other thing. Eventually, we worked so well together. She could sign my name. She could make a decision for me that she knew what I would make, so we did get along good. And I told all my department heads that they weren't to be calling me on the phone and asking what to do, that they should make the decision themselves. And if it wasn't a good decision, we'd take care of it the next day. So they came forward, they made good decisions. There weren't many times that we had to make corrections. And it developed their administrative abilities, I think, that you had confidence in. Well, I had Bradley, the first child, Jane, the second child, while I went back to work. And then, for some reason or other, I had 2 more. Boom, boom, just like that. And unfortunately, I couldn't keep good health. I hired, we had an older woman who was excellent with the children. And then I hired a girl And we lived kind of out in the country, so we would furnish them a car so when they had time off, they could go see their friends. And we finally hired this one young lady, and she always wore a sweatshirt. And she was a farm girl, nice young lady. And I came home one night, and she got up to go upstairs, and she moaned and went to her knees, and I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "I don't know." So I said, "Well, come over and lay down." And she laid down, and I felt of her tummy, and I said, "You're pregnant. You're going to have a baby." "Oh, no." I said, "Have you had relations with a man?" "No." Well, I said, "Get in the car, we're leaving." So I took her to the hospital, and she had a baby and put it out for adoption. And she came back and worked again for a while. But that was a really eye-opening thing. Oh, one of the things I did sometime between the third and the fourth is I always left the babies in the hospital for a couple of days so I could go home and see the other two without, they kept you for 10 days in the hospital in those times. And I remember the minute the baby was born and I could get up to my feet, I walked the halls. And all the young girls were there. Of course, I was older back then, in my 30s. And they all looked like they were still pregnant. And I walked my stomach off real quick. I had trouble getting help, so I did resign. And I came back, and I had hired a woman to come in and instruct my kids how to swim because I didn't want anybody to drown in that pool. And I couldn't afford to do that again because they were expensive. So I decided I would learn to be a swimming instructor. So I went and took life saving, and then I took the instructor's exam. And I remember standing in that pool while they told us all about the different strokes. And I came home and I was so cold, I wrapped my legs in heating pads and went to bed until I could get warmed up. That was the hardest thing I'd ever done, standing around in that cold pool. We had about 6 classes a day for swimming, and I think we had 8 students per class. And the money I earned that summer is what we ate on, because we were a little strapped for cash. And the next summer, there were only 2 private pools in the whole city of Bloomington. And I don't think the schools were teaching swimming yet, like we are now. And so I think I trained almost half of Bloomington how to swim. And eventually, I had a class for the mothers, if they wanted to come and see. We had a lot of time. When my son was a little bit older, and the girls were all the children were good swimmers because they belonged to a swim club at school. So they were excellent swimmers. And so they took off. I used them for demonstrators in the water, so I didn't have to get in and get cold again. And we had a lot of fun. I think we taught beginners, and then we taught advanced beginners. Did we go any higher? Did we teach intermediates? I don't remember that. Anyway, we used that pool a lot. And I can remember on the weekends we'd have a party and sit around with our cocktails and want to know what the poor people were doing. It was kind of fun. Anyway, in the meantime, my husband had bought this big building, and this calf replacer company. So in the daytime, after the children were in school, from 9 to 3, I would go down there and do whatever I could to run the feed business or to help with he started his own construction company. And it worked good. We got along fine until the feed business was already going down. And we finally closed that up and my husband just did construction. But I remember the first year Well, I got to tell you, my husband worked in many towns, Montana, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and one time he was working out west, and a farmer drove in, wrecked his car. He drove to the nearest town and sold the wrecked car, or dumped it and bought a new one, and off they went. So eventually he decided he had to learn how to fly. So he got himself a Beechcraft, Musketeer, and flew that to the job so he could decrease the time that he spent on the road. Well, then of course everybody else had to learn how to be a pilot. So I took pilot lessons, and my son Brad took them, and I don't think you got that far, did you?
Just ground school.
The school. Anyway, so I finally got my solo out to Jamestown, North Dakota, and got my license, and I put it in my dresser drawer, and I never flew by myself. I was the co-pilot. I flew by the roads, and my husband flew by the IFR. And we had, so now that we had a plane to celebrate, we went down to Brownsville, Texas. And we ended up in a country club, and we bought a house down there. So then we would fly down there with the kids and have a vacation. And that was great fun. And then we flew down to Arkansas, near Hot Springs, Arkansas. Hot Springs, Arkansas, there was another country club thing, and we bought a house in there. Don't ask me why. And then when we were down in Texas, we bought a condo on, what's the island? Padre Island. And when my husband died, I had to get rid of all these properties. Oh, then I went to Saudi Arabia for 3 months. While I was working, I used to go to all my reunions and meet my classmates. And I met one time, and they needed somebody that wasn't interested in being an administrator or advancement. They didn't want me pushing their load. And they needed someone to work with the nursing department. So they offered me a job, which I took. And I worked there 7 years. And while I was there, one of our classmates was working for a contractor that had a contract in Saudi Arabia, and they were going to be setting up a hospital, and they needed a hospital administrator, a nursing director, and a records person to set the hospital up. So 3 of us volunteered, and we went over. We went over via Great Britain and through Europe and over to Saudi Arabia. And we were there 3 months, and I was appalled that the equipment they gave us to start this hospital was about 20 years old. It was outdated. And but we set the hospital up. I worked with a boy from Israel. What's the country near there? Anyway, they were all foreigners. We had Chinese, they were the bankers. The Filipinos were the workers, Filipino nurses and Filipino outdoor workers. And we worked, we had to set up the policies and procedures for the hospital, and then distribute all the equipment, set it up. And when you went into town, you had to wear your hair covered, and I was going to bring my long dress I had that I bought from Saudi Arabia. And it was an interesting tour. They had the dress police, and so to be sure that you were dressed properly. And women couldn't drive, and we went any place, we always had to have a man with us. And when we were in the town shopping, some of the girls had their little bottoms pinched by some of them Saudi Arabians. It never happened to me. And liquor was not allowed. In the American compound, some of the Americans would make liquor in their rooms, and if they got caught, that was not a good idea. If the Saudis wanted to have a vacation, they'd go over to Bahrain. In Bahrain, they could drink and didn't have to wear the big coverings. We were invited to a private home, and there, when you're invited, the men eat in one room, and the ladies got to go in the back quarters and eat with the women. They're separated. And if you lost something, like if you forgot something in the airport, it would be there 2 weeks later. And they had what they called the gold suits. You'd go to them, and everybody had their gold chains and watches and whatever, all out on the counter. And nobody ever stole anything, because if you did, they cut your hand off. And if a woman was caught having sex with another man, she was buried up to her neck, and then they stole her. So it's a rough country. I don't know if it's as bad yet, but it was in those years. That was in 1980. And when I came home, we came through Singapore. Did you know Singapore was a country? I thought it was just a city. Anyway, I was kind of scared when we were in Singapore, because there were soldiers with machine guns standing on the corners. I was really uncomfortable with that. But I Googled it to look up to see where it was, and it's a country, Singapore. Then we went to Hong Kong, and I think we stayed there about 2 days, and I had a couple dresses made. Boom, you went in, you got measured, you picked out the thing, and the next day you picked it up. And then we stopped in Hawaii, did a tour of Hawaii, and came home. It was a good experience, and I would not have, I'm happy that I had that experience. I retired in 1981, and we sold our house. In the meantime, that 3 acres we had, we platted off an acre in the back and put in 2 lots and sold them. And then we plotted a lot in the front and put a house there, and then sold the big house. And we had Grandma's house, and we had another house. I don't know why we had 10,000 10th Avenue, but we always had a house for one of our kids to live in, it seems like. And eventually we sold all the houses and went to Mesa. Our daughter Jane was in Tucson going to school, and so our friend John, that was in Jamaica, settled Adventure out, so we settled there too. And eventually, when my husband could no longer make the steps, they were unsure, we had diabetes, we bought a house in Dreamland. And when we bought the house there in 89, and he died in 90. And it took me a year to settle his estate, get rid of all the stuff. We had a